Your soulmate is saying, I have to tell you what really happened, before someone else does. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because this story is for you, and your heart needs this right now. Imagine someone sitting alone long after everyone else has gone to sleep. The room is quiet except for the ticking of a clock. A phone rests on the table with an unfinished message on the screen. Their fingers hover over the keyboard, then stop. They erase every word, only to begin again. Not because they don't know what to say, but because the truth has become too important to say carelessly. Tonight, they finally realize they can't let someone else tell the story for them. If the truth is going to be heard, it has to come from their own heart. For months, they convinced themselves that silence was protecting everyone. They believed that saying nothing would prevent pain, avoid conflict, and allow life to quietly move on. But silence has a strange way of growing heavier with time. What once felt like protection slowly became regret. Every day they waited, another opportunity slipped away. Every conversation left unfinished became another reminder that honesty delayed often becomes honesty complicated. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because your heart needs this right now. They walked through a quiet neighborhood just before sunset. The streets were peaceful. Children laughed in the distance. Neighbors watered flowers growing beside white fences. Everything looked calm, yet inside they carried a conversation that had never truly ended. They passed an old mailbox and remembered every letter they had written but never sent. Some contained apologies. Others contained gratitude. A few simply contained the truth they had been too afraid to speak. As they continued walking, they realized something unexpected. The hardest words aren't always the painful ones. Sometimes the hardest words are the honest ones. Because honesty asks us to become vulnerable. And vulnerability asks us to trust. That realization stayed with them long after they returned home. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because your heart needs this right now. Later that evening they found an old journal resting on the highest shelf of a bookcase. Dust covered its cover, but inside every page held memories from another season of life. They slowly turned the pages until one sentence caught their attention. The truth doesn't become smaller because I ignore it. They smiled sadly. Years had passed since they first wrote those words. Yet they had forgotten to live by them. How often do people already know what they need to do, yet keep waiting for the perfect moment? How many important conversations disappear simply because fear convinces us there will always be another chance? Sometimes tomorrow never arrives in the way we imagine. Sometimes the right moment is simply the moment we choose courage. Don't scroll. Listen carefully. Because your heart needs this right now. The following morning they visited a quiet cafe where soft music played in the background. A young couple sat nearby laughing over breakfast. An elderly man read his newspaper beside the window. A student quietly studied with headphones on. Life continued normally around them. Yet they couldn't stop thinking about the message they still hadn't sent. A waitress noticed they seemed distracted and gently asked, "Everything okay?" They smiled politely. I'm deciding whether telling the truth will make things harder. The waitress paused before answering. Sometimes the truth makes today harder. But hiding it makes every tomorrow harder. Those simple words settled deeply inside them. They thanked her quietly, finished their tea, and walked outside with a clearer mind than they had carried in months. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because your heart needs this right now. As they crossed a small bridge overlooking a peaceful river, they watched the water continue moving without hesitation. It didn't stop to explain where it had been. It didn't apologize for leaving yesterday behind. It simply flowed forward. The river became another lesson. Life isn't asking us to carry every secret forever. Sometimes healing begins the moment truth is allowed to move freely. Not to hurt anyone. Not to win an argument. But to make room for honesty. As clouds drifted slowly overhead, they realized they weren't afraid of telling the truth itself. They were afraid of losing control over how someone else might respond. That fear had kept them silent far longer than necessary. But another realization soon followed. We can choose honesty. We cannot choose another person's reaction. And perhaps that has always been enough. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because your heart needs this right now. That afternoon they visited a quiet park where children played beneath tall oak trees. Sitting on a weathered wooden bench, they noticed an elderly woman feeding birds. She smiled warmly and said, "People spend too much energy trying to control the ending. They forget their responsibility is simply to tell the truth with kindness." The words felt strangely familiar. Almost like advice they had been waiting years to hear. For the first time, they stopped rehearsing imaginary conversations inside their head. Instead, they simply accepted one fact. Whatever happened next. They wanted it to be built on honesty rather than assumptions. As evening arrived, golden sunlight reflected across the nearby lake. Everything felt peaceful. Not because every problem had disappeared. Because one important decision had finally been made. They would stop allowing fear to write their story. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because your heart needs this right now. Returning home, they unlocked their front door and placed the journal back on the desk. This time, instead of writing another page filled with uncertainty, they wrote something different. If someone hears the truth about my life, I want it to come from me. Not from rumors. Not from assumptions. Not from silence. Because honesty deserves its own voice. Reading those words aloud brought an unexpected sense of peace. Outside, the first stars appeared above the quiet neighborhood. They looked at the unfinished message on their phone once again. This time, they didn't erase it. They simply took one slow breath. Because they understood something that changed everything. The truth isn't meant to imprison us. It's meant to free us. And sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't speaking perfectly. It's finally choosing to speak at all. But the story doesn't end here. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because if you're still here, your heart needs this right now. The story didn't pause because the truth disappeared. It paused because some truths need courage before they can become words. Imagine someone standing outside their home just before sunrise, holding a phone they almost used 100 different times. Every morning they told themselves, maybe today. Every evening they whispered, maybe tomorrow. But tomorrow kept becoming another excuse, and silence slowly built walls that honesty could have prevented. They weren't afraid of the truth itself. They were afraid of being misunderstood. That fear followed them everywhere. Into ordinary conversations. Into quiet evenings. Into sleepless nights where every memory replayed differently than it actually happened. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because your heart needs this right now. The following morning they decided to drive somewhere they hadn't visited in years. The road led through rolling hills, quiet fields, and small towns where life moved at a slower pace. The familiar scenery brought back memories they had tried to forget. Not memories filled with anger. Memories filled with unfinished conversations. They remembered every opportunity they had to explain themselves. Every moment they chose silence instead. Every chance they believed there would always be more time. Looking back, they realized something painful. Time doesn't solve misunderstandings. Honest conversations do. As they reached a quiet overlook, they parked the car and stepped outside. The wind moved gently through the trees while distant birds welcomed the morning. Everything around them felt peaceful. Yet inside, another realization quietly settled. Silence had protected them from uncomfortable conversations. But it had also protected the misunderstanding from ever being corrected. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because your heart needs this right now. They sat on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the valley below. In their pocket rested the same phone carrying the unfinished message. This time they opened it again. Not to send it. Just to read it honestly. Halfway through the words they stopped. Something wasn't right. The message explained events. But it never explained feelings. It defended actions. But it never admitted fear. For the first time they understood that people don't always need perfect explanations. Sometimes they simply need sincerity. So they erased everything again. Not because they were giving up. Because they were finally ready to tell the truth instead of protecting their image. Don't scroll. Listen carefully. Because your heart needs this right now. Later that afternoon they wandered into a small bookstore tucked between two old buildings. While browsing the shelves, an elderly shop owner noticed them staring thoughtfully at a collection of journals. The owner smiled. Looking for a fresh start? They laughed softly. Maybe. The owner nodded knowingly. Fresh starts rarely begin with new pages. They begin with honest ones. Those simple words stayed with them long after they left. Maybe the story didn't need to sound impressive. Maybe it only needed to be real. As evening approached they walked through a quiet garden filled with blooming flowers. Every plant carried signs of careful attention. Some had been freshly watered. Others had recently been pruned. Nothing there became beautiful by accident. Growth required care. Relationships did too. Ignoring problems never strengthened roots. Honest care did. That realization felt impossible to ignore. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because your heart needs this right now. For years they had convinced themselves that protecting someone from disappointment was an act of kindness. Now they saw it differently. Sometimes withholding the truth doesn't protect people. It simply prevents them from understanding. It delays healing. It leaves questions where honesty could have created peace. The weight they carried had never come from telling the truth. It came from postponing it. That difference changed everything. Later that night they returned home and opened the old journal once more. On a fresh page they carefully wrote, "I wasn't silent because I didn't care. I was silent because I cared so much that I feared saying the wrong thing." They paused. Then continued writing. But saying nothing became the wrong thing. Reading those words aloud brought tears they hadn't expected. Not tears of regret alone. Tears of release. Sometimes healing begins the moment we stop pretending we handled everything perfectly. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because your heart needs this right now. The next morning they visited the same cafe where the waitress had once reminded them that delayed truth makes every tomorrow harder. She recognized them immediately. "You look different," she smiled. "I feel different." "What changed?" They thought quietly before answering. "I stopped trying to write the version of the story that makes me look perfect. And started writing the version that's true." The waitress smiled. That's usually where healing begins. Those words stayed with them throughout the day. Healing wasn't about rewriting history. It was about finally accepting it honestly. As sunset painted the sky with shades of gold and crimson, they walked once again beside the peaceful river. This time the water looked different. Or perhaps they did. The current reminded them that life keeps moving whether we speak or stay silent. The only question is whether we move with honesty or with regret. They chose honesty. Not because it guaranteed forgiveness. Not because it promised an easy outcome. But because it allowed them to look at themselves without hiding. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because your heart needs this right now. Returning home, they unlocked their door, sat quietly beside the window, and looked once more at the message waiting on their phone. This time they didn't delete it. They didn't rewrite it. They simply added one final sentence. "I'm not asking you to see everything the way I do. I only want you to know what really happened, from me, not from assumptions." They read those words slowly. For the first time in a very long while. They weren't afraid of the truth anymore. They were only afraid of letting another day pass without sharing it. Outside, stars slowly filled the evening sky. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt temporary. Because one decision had finally been made. The truth would no longer remain hidden behind fear. And deep inside, they understood something they wished they had learned years earlier. Honesty cannot change yesterday. But it can completely change the way tomorrow begins. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because if you've stayed with this story, your heart needs this right now. The truth has been waiting patiently, not because it wanted to remain hidden, but because fear kept convincing someone that silence was the safer choice. Yet there comes a moment in every life when silence begins to hurt more than honesty. This is that moment. Not the moment everything is magically fixed, but the moment someone finally understands why they kept running from the conversation they needed most. The person in this story woke before dawn once again. Sleep had come in short, restless moments. They walked to the kitchen, poured a cup of coffee, and stood beside the window watching the first hints of sunlight appear across the horizon. For the first time, they stopped asking themselves, "What if they don't understand me?" Instead, a different question quietly appeared. What if they deserved the truth much sooner? That single thought settled deeper than anything they had felt in months. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because your heart needs this right now. Later that morning, they decided to visit a quiet beach they hadn't seen in years. Gentle waves rolled toward the shore with steady rhythm, leaving smooth patterns in the sand before disappearing again. They watched children building sandcastles, laughing every time the water washed part of their work away. None of them became angry. None of them quit. They simply smiled and started building again. Watching them brought an unexpected lesson. Sometimes we spend too much energy trying to protect what cannot stay exactly the same. Life keeps moving. People keep growing. And every relationship eventually asks for honesty if it hopes to remain strong. As they continued walking along the shoreline, they realized that the truth they had been avoiding wasn't only about one conversation. It was about the version of themselves they had become. Someone who believed silence was always kindness. Someone who confused avoiding conflict with protecting love. Someone who thought carrying every burden alone was strength. Now they saw those beliefs differently. Real strength wasn't hiding difficult emotions. Real strength was learning how to express them with kindness. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because your heart needs this right now. That afternoon they found themselves inside a small library where sunlight poured through tall windows onto rows of well-worn books. Near the back of the room sat an elderly woman quietly writing in a notebook. She looked up with a warm smile. "You seem like you're searching for something." They nodded. "I think I'm searching for the courage to finish a conversation I never started." The woman closed her notebook gently. Courage doesn't usually arrive before the conversation. It arrives while you're having it. Those words lingered long after they left. Maybe courage wasn't something to wait for. Maybe courage grew one honest sentence at a time. Don't scroll. Listen carefully. Because your heart needs this right now. As evening approached, they returned home and opened the journal once more. Instead of writing about the future, they began writing about the past. Not to change it. Not to justify it. Simply to understand it. They remembered every moment fear whispered. "Stay quiet. Every time pride whispered, "They should already know." Every time doubt whispered, "It's too late now." Then they noticed something surprising. None of those voices had ever brought peace. Only postponement. Only uncertainty. Only regret. The truth had never been their enemy. Fear had been. They slowly wrote across the next page. I kept waiting for the perfect moment. Now I understand there was never a perfect moment. There was only the next honest one. Reading those words aloud felt like placing a heavy burden on the ground after carrying it for years. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because your heart needs this right now. The following morning they visited a quiet park where autumn leaves drifted gently from tall trees. An older groundskeeper carefully swept the walking paths. Curious, they asked, "Do the leaves ever stop falling?" The man smiled. "No. But every season teaches the trees what they're ready to release." Those simple words carried unexpected wisdom. People have seasons too. Seasons of learning. Seasons of waiting. Seasons of letting go. And seasons where truth finally becomes impossible to ignore. Perhaps this was that season. As they sat on a nearby bench, they looked through old messages stored on their phone. Some made them smile. Others reminded them of opportunities lost through hesitation. But instead of feeling trapped by regret, they felt grateful. Every mistake had taught them something. Every delay had revealed what fear can quietly steal. Every unfinished sentence had shown them the value of honesty. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because your heart needs this right now. That evening, rain began falling softly outside. They lit a small lamp beside the journal and wrote one final reflection for the day. I thought staying silent protected everyone. Now I understand it only protected my fear. The people who truly matter deserve honesty, even when it's difficult. Not because honesty guarantees agreement. Because honesty creates the possibility for understanding. They closed the journal slowly. Outside, the rain faded. The clouds drifted apart. Moonlight quietly filled the room. For the first time in a very long while, they no longer felt trapped between speaking and staying silent. The decision had already been made inside their heart. All that remained was the conversation itself. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because your heart needs this right now. Sometimes we spend years believing that one difficult conversation will ruin everything. Yet often the opposite is true. Avoiding it quietly ruins what honesty might have healed. The truth may not erase every misunderstanding. It may not undo every mistake. But it allows people to move forward without hiding. And that kind of freedom is worth more than the temporary comfort of silence. As the night grew quieter, they picked up their phone once again. This time they didn't stare at the screen wondering what to write. They simply smiled. Because they finally understood that the purpose of telling the truth wasn't to control the ending. It was to honor the beginning of something more honest. The message was almost ready. Not perfect. Just real. And sometimes, real is exactly what the heart has been waiting to hear. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because if you've stayed with this story until now, your heart needs this right now. The moment has finally arrived. Not the kind of moment filled with dramatic music or impossible promises, but the kind that quietly changes a person's life forever. Sometimes the greatest breakthrough isn't hearing the perfect response. It's finally having the courage to tell the truth and letting your heart rest for the first time in a very long while. Early the next morning, the person in our story woke before the sun had fully risen. The sky outside was painted with soft shades of blue, gold, and pale pink. Everything felt calm. They no longer reached for their phone with trembling hands. Instead, they sat quietly by the window, watching the first birds greet the new day. The fear that had followed them for so long wasn't completely gone. But it no longer controlled them. That alone felt like freedom. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because your heart needs this right now. They opened the message one final time. There were no dramatic speeches. No attempts to change the past. No excuses. Only honesty. There is something I should have told you a long time ago. I stayed silent because I thought I was protecting everyone. Looking back, I realize I was only protecting my own fear. If you choose to understand me, I'm grateful. If you need time, I understand that too. But I didn't want someone else telling my story before I had the chance to tell it myself. They read those words twice. Then a third time. For the first time, nothing needed to be added. Nothing needed to be removed. The message wasn't perfect. It was simply true. And sometimes truth is more powerful than perfection. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because your heart needs this right now. They pressed send. Nothing extraordinary happened. The sky didn't suddenly change. The phone didn't ring immediately. There were no instant answers. Only silence. But this silence felt different. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't frightening. It was peaceful. Because this silence no longer carried hidden words. It carried honesty. As they placed the phone on the table, they noticed something they hadn't felt in years. They could breathe deeply again. The weight that had followed them through countless sleepless nights had quietly lifted. Not because every problem was solved. Because they had finally stopped hiding from themselves. Don't scroll. Listen carefully. Because your heart needs this right now. Later that afternoon, they returned to the familiar lake where so many of their reflections had begun. The water shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Children laughed nearby as they skipped stones across the surface. An elderly couple walked hand in hand along the path. Everything seemed wonderfully ordinary. Yet everything inside felt completely different. They realized they had spent years believing that peace depended on someone else's response. Now they understood that peace begins the moment we stop betraying our own values. No reply could ever replace that feeling. As they sat quietly on the old wooden bench, an elderly gardener passed by carrying fresh flowers. He smiled warmly. You look lighter today. They smiled back. I finally stopped carrying something that wasn't meant to stay hidden. The gardener nodded. Truth has a way of making the heart breathe again. Those simple words stayed with them long after he walked away. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because your heart needs this right now. Hours passed. Evening slowly arrived. Golden sunlight faded into soft shades of orange and purple. Their phone finally vibrated. For a brief moment, the old fear tried to return. What if they misunderstood? What if nothing changed? Then another thought quietly replaced it. Whatever the response, they had already chosen honesty. And that choice could never become a mistake. They looked at the message. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't filled with perfect answers. It simply said, "Thank you for telling me yourself." Those 6 words brought more peace than years of silence ever had. Not because every question disappeared, but because understanding had finally become possible. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because your heart needs this right now. As darkness settled across the quiet neighborhood, they walked home beneath a sky filled with countless stars. The same streets looked different now. Not because the world had changed. Because they had. They no longer feared difficult conversations the way they once had. They no longer believed silence automatically protected love. They no longer carried responsibility for controlling every outcome. Instead, they carried something much stronger. Integrity. Courage. Kindness. And the quiet confidence that comes from living honestly. They opened the journal one final time. On the last blank page they wrote, "The greatest lesson wasn't learning how to explain myself. It was learning that truth spoken with kindness is always lighter than silence carried with fear. I cannot choose how others respond. But I can always choose to live honestly. That choice has given me more peace than pretending ever could." They gently closed the journal. Outside, the stars continued shining above the quiet night. Tomorrow still held unknowns. There would still be challenges. There would still be conversations. There would still be moments requiring courage. But those moments no longer felt impossible. Because courage had become a habit instead of an exception. Don't scroll. Listen to this. Because your heart needs this right now. The message of this story was never that someone secretly has a confession waiting for you. It was never a promise that a soulmate is about to contact you. Instead, it reminds us of something deeply human. Truth loses its power when buried beneath fear. Honesty creates room for healing. Kindness makes difficult conversations gentler. And courage often begins with one simple decision to stop hiding behind silence. Sometimes the most important story you'll ever tell is your own. Tell it honestly. Tell it with compassion. Tell it when your heart is ready. Because peace rarely comes from controlling every outcome. It comes from knowing you chose integrity when it mattered most. And perhaps that is the real ending this story has been leading toward all along. Not certainty about tomorrow, but the quiet freedom that comes from living truthfully today.